Hi, Adrian from Thatch Fitness again. This week I wanted to continue on from the discussion last week around sit-ups. Last week I talked about the role of hip flexors sit-ups, and today I want to talk about the role of where your centre of gravity is in terms of being able to do a sit-up. Now the reason why that's important is because even today there is a test that's still used globally known as a 7-stage sit-up test. Now it's a test whereby you have a series of sit-ups that get progressively harder, and it's supposedly a measure of your abdominal strength, but hopefully you'll see at the end of this clip that it has almost nothing to do with your abdominal strength at all. So what am I talking about here? Well, when I talk about doing sit-ups and the ability or non-ability to be able to do sit-up, has largely got to do with where your centre of gravity is compared to where your pivot point is. So if you can see this image on the right, this woman here, so her centre of gravity is indicated by the yellow arrow pointing upwards, and her pivot point, so the point where she's actually going to pivot when she's sitting up, is indicated by the red arrow pointing downwards. Now in this case, those two are in alignment. And what that means is that it makes it relatively easy for her to be able to sit up without having any weight or someone holding her feet down. The equivalent of that would be such as a seesaw, as in the image here, whereby if you get the pivot point exactly right, then what happens is both sides can easily move up and down with little resistance because it's evenly balanced. That's what we see in someone who happens to have those two points in alignment. What typically we see though, and the vast majority of people, they are offset with where their centre of gravity is versus their pivot point. So this example here, you see you've actually got the person's centre of gravity, which is the yellow arrow, it's closer towards this person's head, and their pivot point is still down somewhere near the pelvis. Now in this situation, regardless of how strong they are in their core, it is not possible for them to be able to sit up. Even level 1, which is the easiest level of the 7-stage sit-up test, it isn't possible for someone like this to be able to do that sort of sit-up. Again, the example is to use a seesaw again. This would be a seesaw where the pivot point is offset, and so what happens is the longer end, which is equivalent to your upper body in the human example, is just not able to be able to move up unless there's a huge amount of weight placed on the small end, or in the sit-up example, when you have your feet held down. So the 7-stage sit-up test isn't a good measure of abdominal strength at all. What it's measuring is it's measuring where your pivot point is versus where your centre of gravity is, and if they're out of alignment, it just isn't possible to be able to perform a sit-up at all. And so it's a test we really shouldn't be too concerned about. And again, as I discussed last week, don't be so concerned that you can't sit all the way up, because it isn't a good measure of your abdominal strength. There are much better tests that we can do, which I'll talk about in the future, that are a true indication of how good your abdominal strength is.